Good morning, good afternoon and good evening everybody, and welcome to the webinar on shock responsive social protection in practice, perspectives from Kenya and Mozambique. Today's webinar is the second of our series on social protection in humanitarian, fragile and risk-prone contexts. The first webinar took place in May, jointly with the Cash Learning Partnership, CaLP, and it discussed some concepts on the use of social protection in response to shocks. Today's event is brought to you by Oxford Policy Management, OPM, in the UK, in partnership with the Hunger Safety Net programme, which is one of the main government-led cash transfer programmes in Kenya. In the first half of the meeting, we'll hear from our two speakers. And then in the second half, we'll have a question and answer session. Please remember that you can ask questions in writing to the speakers at any time during the webinar. And these will be answered in the question and answer session or in writing afterwards on our online community on socialprotection.org. And you can submit your questions either through the GoToWebinar chat bar or else on Twitter using the hashtag #SPOrgWebinar. My name's Claire O'Brien and I'll do my best to moderate the discussion. I'm a senior consultant in the Poverty and Social Protection team at OPM, and I'm leading OPM's routine monitoring of the operations of HSNP in Kenya. I'm also managing our global research programme funded by DFID on shock-responsive social protection systems, which is exploring the factors that affect the ability of social protection systems to respond flexibly to emergencies, and which includes Mozambique as one of its case studies. We're delighted to welcome today two speakers, Catherine Fitzgibbon and Sarah Bailey. First, Catherine will present to us about Kenya's experience in scaling up the Hunger Safety Net programme in drought emergencies. Catherine's an independent consultant who's been providing technical support to the government of Kenya's National Drought Management Authority on the targeting and scalability of cash assistance in northern Kenya for some years. And she's worked in the Horn of Africa for over 15 years in a number of roles for NGOs and UN and donor partners. She's undertaken a range of policy and research work in social protection, poverty graduation and resilience. And then after that, Sarah Bailey will make a presentation called Shock Responsive Social Protection in Mozambique, Challenging the Paradigm. Sarah is a research associate at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, and also an independent consultant. She's a researcher on the shock responsive social protection system study that's led by OPM in collaboration with ODI and CaLP, and she's contributing to the Mozambique case study. A former aid worker, Sarah is an expert on humanitarian practice and policy. She has over 12 years' experience researching, evaluating and managing humanitarian programs for a variety of donors, UN agencies and NGOs. So I'd now like to hand over to Catherine, who will tell us about the design and implementation of HSNP's emergency payment mechanism, which extends coverage of the cash transfer to support extra households in the event of a drought. So Catherine, over to you.
Good afternoon or morning or evening to everyone. Yes, as Claire said, I've been working with the National Drought Management Authority in Kenya for the last 2.5 years. One of the aspects of that cash transfer program is its ability to scale up during emergencies. So I'm just going to talk you through the experience that we went through in developing that scalability element of this program. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. Hunger Safety Net programme is an unconditional cash transfer program that operates in the 4 poorest and most drought-prone counties of Kenya. If you see the map there, it's the ones with the dark line around them. The HSNP provides approximately $25 in cash up to 100,000 beneficiaries every 2 months. They're the routine standard beneficiaries that have been identified as the poorest households in those counties. It's actually been operating since 2008. Phase 2, the current phase, started in 2012 with the additional objective of being able to scale up and down in response to shocks, particularly drought. So therefore, at the beginning of this program, all households in those 4 counties were voluntarily registered. So in total now we have on a database 374,000 households, which is, we estimate, well it's not clear, about 95% of all households in those counties. Those 374,000 households have been in the last 3 years registered with bank accounts. And those bank accounts are through a bank here in Kenya called Equity Bank, and which means that every household gets an ATM card which has biometric data on it that people can basically use as a normal functional bank account. And then in addition to banking main banks in those counties, there are also a range of small agents that just work in local shops that act as agents for the bank and have POS points of sale which they can actually use to transact the cash transactions. Next slide. So what that means is that although there's 100,000, although not quite 100,000 because we've had issues with some people having IDs to get bank accounts, but we've probably got nearly 90% of households with a bank account now. That means that the number of routine beneficiaries, as you can see, they're the green columns here, has been increasing over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, as we've had more and more routine beneficiaries registered. But at the same time, there's been registration of the non-routine beneficiaries, and this orange columns here show the temporary scale-ups that we've achieved at various points in the last year and a half. The orange ones were scale-ups in response to drought, and as you can see there, in October last year, 2015, there was a payment made to everyone who at that time had an active bank account, which was 208,000 households, as an El Nino response. So because it was an El Nino year, there was a lot of concern that there was going to be a very intense rainy season. The rains usually arrive about October, and as an early response or mitigation strategy, it was decided to pay out then to everyone with a bank account so that they had some cash should the rains come, should flooding come, and should people not be able to maybe move around or get to banking agents. So that was done then. And subsequent to that, there was actually another one. I think can't quite see the whole slide on my. There was another scale up just done in April. So I can't see all this on there. Okay, next slide. So, and just to explain on that, yeah, the HSNP does have standard operating procedures. We have now fully developed the operating procedures for the scalability process. So just coming back to before we started doing scale up, we had a set of principles which we used to kind of design the way we wanted this to work. And the first principle really was not about responding, it was about early response. So very much this, what we call in the spirit of no regrets. So the idea is that cash would be paid out often very, very early in a crisis cycle or in a drought cycle. And even if it then continued to rain immediately after the payment was made, we were not going to regret that. The fact is, it has been proved continually that early response saves money, saves resources. The other issue we had to learn to accept is the response may be a bit imperfect, but it will be timely. So the idea that we would prioritize time and speed of response over the idea of perfect targeting, both geographically and within populations, etc. So we were able to do this to some extent because there was, we had this database of all the households, and as part of the registration process of registering the whole 374,000 households, a sort of proxy means testing and a wealth ranking exercise had been done. So effectively all of those households are ranked into some form of wealth category, with the 100,000 being the routine households, and therefore we can scale up from those routine households up to whatever percentage coverage we decide, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So therefore no targeting takes place at the time of the crisis, and that's because we've got this households that's wealth ranked. Now again, there's lots of issues. Is this perfect? Things change. The people that may be affected most by drought may not be the poorest. All of these arguments, you know, are very much something that's been debated. But again, the idea is at least we get money quick, even if it's not to exactly the right people initially. The payment was going to be the same. Any scale-up payment was the same as the regular cash transfer. Just made life easier. It was much easier for beneficiaries and communities to accept that, you know, HSNP gives this amount, whether it's a routine payment or a scale-up payment. Therefore, for drought, the scale-up, the trigger of the scale-up was identified as a remotely sent satellite data, in this case the Vegetation Condition Index, or VCI. This is the satellite drought early warning indicator that NDMA already used. It's their key indicator for flagging up drought conditions. The reasons why we chose this is that satellite data is absolutely quantitative, it's totally objective, it's a very early onset indicator, and it becomes financially acceptable in that, as I might explain, we were looking at how we can finance this scale up, and one of the ways for financing was getting insurance and interacting with potential insurance mechanisms, and they will only consider insuring this sort of scale up on the basis of utterly objective and verifiable data. And really, of all of the suite of early warning indicators that NDM may use, and of which there's many, this is really the only one that fits that criteria. So it's not at all dependent on on-ground assessments or validations. There's no on-the-ground assessment to trigger the scale-up at the current time. For El Nino, it was just a decision made as an early flood preparedness moment. There was no actual early warning indicator. It was just a range of government and, you know, the humanitarian agencies deciding that, you know, this is it was considered a real threat, El Nino, and therefore a payment should go out. And as I said, it goes to a predefined set of households, so there is no targeting. And the main issue here is that it's quick speed is the main issue here, rather than perfection. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. Okay, so going through those those principles, in actual to develop a practical scalability framework that actually set out the rules and guidelines as to how we were going to scale up, we really need to answer these questions, and it's surprising how hard it is to get groups of people to agree on the answers to these questions. So where were we going to scale up? What was the geographic coverage? You scale up by village, by ward, by sub-county, by whole counties. The trigger, as I mentioned, we've used VCI, but there was a lot of debate about what should actually trigger a scale up, and a lot of people asked this question, you know, when discussing scalability elsewhere. Who should get the money? Which households? How do you select those households? How much should they get? How long should they get that payment for, and how often are you likely to be scaling up? So, you know, as I said, the principles that we had taken on board when we started this helped us to answer a lot of those questions, but nonetheless there was a lot of debate in answering those questions. Next slide. So here I've got the current framework. So basically those questions are sort of systematized into this table. So as you can see, the geographic location is sub-county. These are sort of lower than the county level. The VCI, or the Vegetation Condition Index, is used as the trigger. These relate to drought phase equivalents. NDMA already had this, so again we went with what was there. We didn't try and reinvent the wheel. They had established these ratings that say there's a severe drought or extreme drought, and as you can see, when the VCI in any sub-county hits the severe drought status, which is 10 to 15, or worse than that, goes below 10 to 20. When it goes below 20, it's a severe drought. Below 10, it's extreme drought. And at those points, a scale-up is triggered. The coverage in a severe drought goes up to 50% of households are covered in that sub-county, and in extreme drought, 75%. And then it explains the amount. The payment lasts for as long as the sub-county is in that drought status, and no more. Next slide. So of course there are lots of, those parameters and variables could be moved any which way, but what we found was really useful was the development of a financial costing model. So the World Bank Disaster Risk Finance team helped us to develop a quite sophisticated model into which we could put all those different variables. And what we did is we modeled those variables against VCI for which data existed. And VCI data in Kenya goes back for, I think, 16, 17 years. 2001, because what was important was understanding how on a basis. So what this graph shows us here is the years where there's extremes and the average cost. So what we've worked out is, on the basis of the framework shown in the last slide, the average cost of scaling up in Kenya on those 4 counties on this basis is approximately $6 to $7 million a year. Clearly that varies quite drastically. So the very bad drought years, 2006, 2011, you can see the need for scale up, and this was much higher. But that's a really important figure to have, because if Kenya wants to be able to scale up on this basis, on a guaranteed basis, it can plan for having that much available, so that on average that would be enough to keep you going through bad years. And also it really helped to whittle down differences of opinion about how many people should be paid, what should be the amount of payment, how many months should they be paid for, because we can put in all these things and we go, well, if you want to spend 30 million a year, you can have this. If you want to spend 2 million a year, you can have this. So what was considered a reasonable budget at this point in time that could be funded on an annual basis was 6 million. And therefore that helped to answer a lot of the questions and parameters in that first slide. Sorry, the next slide. So just as I outlined in the framework, this is the 4 counties. This just shows them as sub-counties, and this shows it as typical VCI reading for a certain month. And what you can see is there are certain sub-counties that are in severe and certain counties in the dark red that are in extreme. And what happens is that this generates a quota. So all those sub-counties in red, you take the total population, you half the total population on the database, you deduct the routine beneficiaries, and the remaining figure is your scale-up figure. For the severe counties, you take 75% of the household on the database, you deduct the routine, and the remainder is the scale-up. So the scale-up is higher in extreme. So as the drought deepens, the scale-up goes higher. Those percentages, relatively arbitrary, but actually start to reflect, when we looked historically at the short and long range needs assessment, that sort of reflected the most generous needs assessments that had been made when there was considered drought in previous times. Okay, next slide. So as explained, all the households that have been registered in the 4 counties have been ranked wealth-wise. This is in no way a perfect methodology used to identify this, but it does mean that basically we can identify which households would scale up to if you go from the existing. So if you, for example, say that, you know, on average 26% of the population in the north are routine beneficiaries. So when a scale up goes to 50%, you just go through the database up to the next 50%. And as I said, the routine payment, the scale up payment is the same as the routine payment, which again keeps things simple and easier to understand for beneficiaries. But of course, there's also debates that people might need more in a drought, and maybe the scale up should reflect something like the food basket. And you know, there are these debates, but we haven't moved to looking at that sort of issue just yet. Next slide. So what happened as we were having these debates and doing the costing and developing the scalability guidelines, that was in early 2015. At that time, drought conditions were starting to worsen in these areas. And by February 2015, we had the situation which I just shown there, where we had 2 sub-counties in extreme drought and a whole county in extreme, and 2 a whole county in severe, and things looked like, you know, it was going to get worse. So we were under a lot of pressure. Goes, well, you've carded a large number of the population. Let's pilot it. Let's try this. And that was a really important thing to do. And we tried 2 different ways. What emerged as one of the major problems to start with is the scaling up according to sub-counties. So if you can see on that map, the county of Marsabit has 2 sub-counties there, North Hor, which is red at the top, and Lysamis, which is yellow at the bottom. That boundary is obviously totally political. The geographic and, you know, ecological conditions in those areas were exactly similar. And when we came to scale up, there was resistance from within the government saying you cannot give to villages on the red side and not the yellow side, because on the ground there is no difference. And it is extremely difficult or virtually impossible to explain to communities what VCI is. They just don't agree with you that a camera in the sky can know more about their drought conditions than them. And they're right to a large extent. It's just obviously when you aggregate VCI over a certain area, you will get 1 score, and over another area you'll get another score. So we tried a variety of ways of which the VCI is used to generate a quota. That happens, and we then looked at how we can reallocate that quota, what was considered more fairly. So what happens now is that although the quota is generated on the basis of, for example, North Hor and Moyale, as you can see there, the quota is reallocated to any sub-county that's in moderate drought or above. So the scale-up was actually across the whole of those counties within green. Okay. Next slide. Just to say, the post-distribution monitoring showed that on average 58% of households did receive the cash. So we did double the average number of households that got the cash, that got the usual coverage. The cash was primarily spent on food, although school expenses was the next biggest expenditure. What was also interesting was there was no discernible impact on price availability of staple foods, which was considered a big risk by scaling up at this level and at this amount. Next slide. Yeah. So just to recap on some of the lessons learned, the mass registration and bank account opening exercise for phase 2 was very, you know, it was a massive operational exercise. It has been expensive, and it's been logistically very difficult. Saying that, what we see now is the value of that. Now that people are there, they have the bank accounts, money can be transferred at almost nil cost to them to any configuration of those households and for any amount. And it can also be used for other programs or other, other payments. I think this is one of the few examples I've seen where early warning, as in VCI data, comes in at the beginning of the month and a payment can be made into bank accounts within 2 weeks. Because there is no ground truthing it, we just go with the VCI, it's paid out. Having a cost model developed was extremely useful because it really helped people to think through how scalability should work when they could see the costs of doing it every which way. And we also did it at a time which was not in drought. So we were thinking kind of a bit more rationally and logically, and you weren't trying to spend the money that was available now for drought. You were thinking, how would this work in a very long time on a year-on-year basis? We also, though, found out that the scientific and speedy approaches are not always politically acceptable, and the compromises and changes that were made for the redistribution and reallocation of quotas for scaling up showed us that. I think we also need to consider that cash in a vacuum is not always the most ideal situation, that we need to think, how can we expand those linkages so that people that are scaled for cash are also maybe accessing water or school feeding or, the other sort of responses that happen during a drought. How are we ensuring that the cash can be used to get what people need, drugs for vets, veterinary services, etc. Remaining challenges, at the moment all scale-ups have been funded by DFID, and there is a lot of conversation in country as to how can this be a sustainably financed mechanism. The government is in the process of setting up a national drought contingency fund. I think it's called an national drought emergency fund. That would be the pot into which this this payment the initial funding for HSNP could scale up, could be drawn. Donors could then top this up. The Africa Risk Capacity, which is a sovereign wealth fund insurance mechanism, Kenya is a member of that, and it's signed up to that, and it pays premiums into ARC insurance. ARC pays out on a much more infrequent basis, but certainly in very extreme years, ARC insurance payments would be very important to funding this. County governments, now that there's devolution in Kenya, are also looking very seriously, have actually allocated some money for scaling up as well. So the idea is that the costs could be met through, ideally through a layering range of mechanisms. Final slide. So I've got to go. Just a few more challenges. There is the pre-selection of households obviously causes a lot of problems. People don't really know when they're going to get, who's going to get the payment. People aren't aware that they're next in line, or and therefore there's confusion as to why this person got a scale up and I didn't. I think I'm more in need. So we're reviewing all of that and reviewing the whole targeting and pre-selection approach. The information, lots and lots of requests for secondary data, other triggers in other situations. And now we're really thinking hard also about the M&E. What is the impact of scaling up on this ad hoc basis related to VCI, and how do we measure this impact? And there's lots of questions about that. Okay, I'm going to go now because I think I've just run over. I'll hand back to Claire. Is that okay?
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a fantastic run-through of the scale-up mechanism of the HSNP. Just as a reminder to people, I can see some very interesting questions are coming through. Do keep them coming using the chat bar on the GoToWebinar software or on Twitter. And in the meantime, I'd like to give the floor to Sarah Bailey of ODI, who's going to discuss to what extent it makes sense to try to move some of the burden of responding to emergencies onto a social protection system in a context like Mozambique, which has a well-developed disaster risk management mechanism of its own. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. Can you see me? We'll hope the answer is yes.
Yes, we can.
So as Claire said, if we could go ahead and start the presentation. I'm looking at shock responsive social protection in Mozambique. Next slide, please. So this is part of a 2-year study that Claire mentioned that is being led by OPM with ODI, CaLP, and others. And a hypothesis behind the study is that the humanitarian system spends a lot of time and a lot of resources responding to recurrent and long-term crises. And the question then becomes, could it be appropriate in some circumstances to use a country's social protection system to provide some of this response? And so it's really asking, well, if so, what factors would enable social protection systems to be more responsive to shocks, the types of shocks and impacts that are usually met through disaster relief and humanitarian systems? So DFID's funded this 2-year study led by OPM, with ODI, and others. And as part of this, we have 6 case studies, and I am a team member on the Mozambique case study. And I think what's interesting about the approach that we've done for these case studies is that we're combining social protection and humanitarian expertise. So the Mozambique case study is led by Andrew Cardan of OPM, who is a social protection expert, and I myself am a humanitarian expert. And in a way, that's a little bit of a caveat warning that the way that I present these issues is slightly through a humanitarian lens, my choice of language and what I do. But for the actual research, the way we did is we've combined both of our expertise. So when you see the actual report, you'll see that Andrew might discuss some of these issues slightly differently than I do. So just wanted to flag that. Next slide, please. So when we asked the question around shock responsive social protection, when I first joined the study, it was certainly a term that caused me to think, okay, shock responsive. It's a little bit jarring, actually. I know a lot of people who are listening to the webinar might be familiar with it. At the same time, I think when we started to translate this into French and into Portuguese, it really got us thinking around what do we mean by this and how can we explain this? How can we research it in a way that is quite logical, where we think about the real questions that are part of it? And so I'm going to do this presentation without using the term shock responsive. And how we approach this is we did about 4 questions in Mozambique, where we thought, what do we really need to understand in this setting? Well, we need to understand the shocks and the vulnerabilities that people face. We need to understand the social protection systems that are in place, as well as the humanitarian and DRM systems that usually address these shocks. And we also, of course, want to know how well are these systems functioning. Obviously, this was not an in-depth evaluation, but we needed to understand their relative strengths and weaknesses. And finally, that leads us to be able to analyze, well, are there opportunities for social protection systems to play a greater role in responding to the types of shocks and impacts that are usually met through disaster relief and DRM? And are there opportunities for greater synergies between these systems? Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through, in a sense, each of these questions. If we step back and we look at the shocks that people face in Mozambique, they're mainly climatic. So we have flooding and cyclones that affect 250 to 500,000 people every few years. There are ones that are smaller on an almost annual basis. And currently, due to El Nino phenomenon, we have one of the worst droughts in decades. It's affecting many portions of southern Africa, and it certainly has hit Mozambique. And this is affecting about 1.5 million people as of mid-2016. And there's a geographic dimension to risk. So if you think about Mozambique, it actually has a very long coastline, which makes the people living on the coast quite vulnerable to cyclones. It has major river basins, such as the Zambezia, and people living near those basins are quite vulnerable to the floods. And then the droughts are affecting certain portions of the country and not affecting others. And Mozambique, from the standpoint of humanitarian relief, I don't want to downplay the negative impacts that these shocks can have on people's lives, on people's livelihoods, but these are relatively manageable scales of disasters. So if you think about flooding in Pakistan, where you have such massive displacement and hundreds of thousands of people affected, and long-sustained relief operations. In Mozambique, these are relatively smaller operations. There are usually very few, sometimes no deaths in flooding scenarios. And the drought is a bit of an aberration from the norm because you have a much larger group of people affected, and it is the worst drought that's hit Mozambique in decades. And finally, it's not just the climatic shocks, but we also have issues of economic shocks that have hit Mozambique. So the fuel financial crisis in 2008. And there's some political instability and violence. This goes back to the civil war that Mozambique faced that ended in 1992. But there are still political disagreements and tensions that have turned into some violent scenarios in 2013, 2014, and up to the present. Next slide, please. So now I want to move on to look at what are the systems in place to address these shocks. Well, for disaster risk management, I'm not really going to separate out humanitarian response from disaster risk management because within Mozambique, these two are very close. To get into some brief definitions, humanitarian assistance refers to actions designed to save lives, alleviate suffering, and protect dignity during and after crises and emergencies. Whereas disaster risk management is a bit broader in that it encompasses not just this response element, but also a wider portion of issues related to early warning, related to preparedness, and related to recovery. But in Mozambique, these are very much a part of a holistic approach to how risks are dealt with and how they're managed and how they're responded to. So there's a well-functioning government-led disaster risk management system and approach which has evolved substantially in the last 10 years. You may remember, you may have heard that in 2000, 2001, there were quite severe floods that had hit Mozambique. And the government actually was quite unprepared for the floods and for the impacts. Since the end of the Civil War in '92, they'd been shedding a lot of their own capacity to respond to disasters because they had been in a setting where relief assistance was required for years and years. And they wanted to move on to more development and poverty reduction. And in a sense, the 2000 flooding very much caught them unaware, and it was a response that was much more dominated by international actors who led the relief efforts. And after this, the government of Mozambique very much decided to prioritize putting in place disaster risk management systems. They looked at models in South America. They looked at how they could become, very much an effective disaster risk management approach within the government. And as a result, it's evolved substantially in the last 10 years, and their own capacity has evolved. So if we look at their disaster risk management in Mozambique, it's characterized by very strong emphasis on preparedness and annual contingency planning that involves the government and aid agencies looking at various relief scenarios and what they will do within them. There's government leadership coordinating disaster relief, so this is not a setting where you have stereotypical aid agencies running amok and doing their own things. The government INGC body coordinates the actions of both the government and international actors. The government is very much discouraged any actions that it perceives as being linked to dependency. So the idea of giving out free money without a work requirement is not something that the government is on board with at all. And then there's also, while the government leads the coordination of response, it's actually international actors that fund and implement the larger response. So the government has a relatively small contingency fund that it can implement its own small responses, usually within the first 24 to 72 hours after a flood. But once you get beyond this window or into larger disasters that exceed the amount of money budgeted, which can be anywhere from 10 to 15 to $20 million, then you're moving into needing international agencies to fill this gap between the money that the government has to implement its own response and the actions required. But even in spite of the fact that this is mainly done by international agencies and they comprise the bulk of relief efforts, it's still a relatively small recipient of humanitarian funding. I believe it was around, I've got it here, it was the 45th largest humanitarian recipient of funding in 2004 to 2013. And there's a very well-established response protocol for floods and for cyclones. Next slide, please. So how well are these systems working? Well, when it comes to flooding and cyclones, they're working extremely well since they have shored up their capacity. So the responses have been pretty effective because of the preparedness, because of the leadership, because of good coordination, and because, again, these are relatively small scale. But their system has evolved in relation to cyclones and flooding because this has been the main disaster that they have faced. And in the last 15 years, droughts have rarely required any sort of dedicated food security or relief response on any major scale. So the 2016, it started in 2015, but the 2016 drought that they are currently facing is very different in key ways because more people are affected, up to 1.5 million. They're going to be affected for longer than, say, a flooding scenario because of the time between harvests. And it's too early to tell the adequacy of government and international responses to this drought, but it does appear that there are some shortcomings in the current DRM system to enable timely interventions reaching larger numbers of people because the triggers are less obvious, the idea of what to do. So again, because their system has evolved more in relation to flooding, drought has been something that is, I mean, I don't want to say learning as they go, but it's been certainly testing their disaster risk management system in different ways. So the question then becomes, in my view, well, if we have weaknesses in drought response, does this imply a greater role for social protection? So I'd like to move on to describe the social protection systems in Mozambique and whether or not they might have a greater role to play. Next slide, please. So the main programs are non-contributory social assistance interventions under basic social security. So there's one called the PSSB, it's cash transfers to labor-constrained households. We're not really looking at the PSSAS, so I'll leave that one behind. There's also the PASH-2 with a D, which is in-kind benefits to the destitute and ad hoc calamities. So if your house burns down, your local ENASH, which implements social protection, can assist you. And then there's also the PASH-PO with a P, which is a lean season public works. Now, all of these have a few features in common. It's NPCASH, which is the government ministry in charge of social protection, and the implementing body is called ENASH. So all of these are implemented by ENASH staff. They all rely partially or fully on community-based targeting. And the payments and delivery of in-kind benefits are done manually by ENASH staff, which is, as you can imagine, are quite time-consuming. So this is not, you know, as Catherine presented, send transfers at a push of a button, but the payments through the PSSB can actually take up to 10 to 15 days of ENASH's staff time in a given month just to be able to deliver these benefits to people. Next slide, please. So looking at the overall coverage, these four programs together reach about 8.5% of the population and 15% of the poor population. Now the PSSB is by far the largest of the programs. So out of 445,000 people covered in 2015, 366,000, I'm sorry, that's households, 366,000 households were the PSSB. Now that's the one that's the cash payments to labor-constrained households. By contrast, the PASH, the public works, was 12,500, and the PASH-2, the in-kind assistance to the destitute and ad hoc calamities, was 57,000 households. There's a large variation of coverage across the provinces and even within the districts within provinces. So Zambezia, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest province that's hit by both drought and by flooding, actually has some of the lowest coverage of social protection programs. Overall, the budget allocations to social protection, the government's share of total funding to social protection, and the coverage of social protection programs have increased substantially since 2011. So let's see, the PSSB was 90% government financed in 2015, the cash transfers, and it was only 22% financed by the government in 2011. So to give you a sense, the government ownership is increasing, as are the coverage of the programs. Next slide, please. And stepping back and looking at the social protection as a whole, well, there's a government narrative on poverty reduction that's very much, again, on job creation, so substantial interest on the public works side of the equation. MGCash, the ministry that is in charge of social protection, is not extremely powerful, which gives some challenges for coordinating other sectoral activities and holding other line ministries to task. And I think this is a bit in contrast with the INGC, which manages disaster risk management, is relatively strong in terms of their convening power. The social protection sector is supported by a number of development actors, partners, with competing agenda and not consensus on the nature of support that should be provided to the government. There is consensus among certain actors and different views amongst others. Next slide, please. So what do we see when we look at these social protection systems? What role are they currently playing in terms of responding to these covariate shocks? Shocks that are hitting a large number of people, the climatic shocks that I spoke about earlier. Well, currently, the MGCash and ENASH do participate in the government-led coordination of disaster relief. So it's not that they are on the outside of the system at all. As with other ministries and sectors and actors in the government, they are part of these systems. On paper, they are supposed to ensure the inclusive populations in relief assistance. And there are certainly some examples of this. So one approach in Mozambique is the resettlement of households in floodplains, which is a challenging task for a few reasons. It's been going on for decades. And we've seen examples of ENASH, for example, making sure that local disabled households have appropriate housing within the resettlement sites. However, when it comes to the provision of relief, if anything, it might be that some ENASH or some social protection beneficiaries are actually deprioritized. So there are both ENASH and INGC staff that indicated that sometimes these beneficiaries are considered to already be covered. So if you're a PSSB beneficiary and you're getting a cash transfer, then you won't necessarily be a high priority for humanitarian aid because, well, you're already receiving your cash transfer. And that can be a bit problematic because that PSSB cash transfer is about, I believe, around $12 per month. If you think about an overall value of, say, a food voucher or assistance along those lines, it's actually going to be much, much greater. It can be up to $15 to $20 per person per household. So it would be a bit of a double whammy to be a vulnerable population person or a vulnerable person who has been affected by a disaster and is being deprioritized for assistance because you're considered covered. And finally, the new social protection strategy does foresee, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot something. In the drought, we do have an example of the PASH, the public works, the timing being changed in 2016 so that it'll be more coinciding to this current time when people are affected. However, this could be a zero-sum game. It's not clear that then they'll have the money to implement when they usually do later this year. And that seems to be driven by the governor of Gaza who requested this, and this is not a request coming from the social protection sector itself. So it's a bit political. And I think floods, it's difficult to really talk about an expanded potential role for ENASH during a flood because actually their own capacity to deliver payments, their own offices, they're flood affected. So this is when they face significant constraints. The new strategy, though, does foresee for social protection, as a new social protection strategy, to play a greater role in being responsive to floods, cyclones, and drought. And this is through expanded role of PASH, the Public Works Program, and PASH-DOD, the in-kind benefits. However, there are some constraints that I'll now move on to discuss. Next slide, please. So looking at the coverage and the capacity of the social protection sector and of the government actors that implement it, we're seeing that there are some significant barriers, say, taking on more people or expanding the role of social protection in response to emergencies. With the public works, you can change the timing, and you can also, for example, have additional, perhaps international aid agencies implement more in a similar model. But there's extremely limited coverage right now. You're talking about 12,500 households. And also, if you change the timing, there's not, at this point in time, additional funding to do it later on in the year. Now, obviously, that could be rectified, but you're still talking about a relatively small set of households. And we could look at it playing a more preventative role through providing cash transfers to households at a lean season time, and also even through the creation of assets that could be useful. But unfortunately, the salary or the benefit from this, the transfers are so low that the preventative role is quite questionable at this time. And this isn't really about asset creation. A lot of the tasks that are done are ones that are quite small, so such as cleaning streets and participating along those lines. So this isn't necessarily large assets that would be useful. And even then, that's a hypothesis to be tested rather than assumption to be made. For the PASH 2, also limited coverage, multiplicity of eligibility criteria, and the inclusion tends to be done on an ad hoc basis. So both of these could add to humanitarian response, but they're unlikely to become a major substitute for it. Now, in theory, the PSSB could be used to adjust payments at times of drought. It does reach a few more people. It's a mechanism that you could switch the payments and increase it. However, the government has zero desire to do this. They do not want to create additional expectations in the future about payment levels, and they are not keen to give out money for disaster. So no desire on the government part at this point in time. And the idea of using, say, common systems, so what if there was a common registry database of social protection beneficiaries that could be used for humanitarian targeting, even if you had one, which at this point there's not a common one, it would cover less than 9% of the population, and humanitarian targeting has not been raised as a problem. So it would be a bit of a solution in search of a problem. Okay, final slide. So in conclusion, I do think that Mozambique is a case that tests the hypotheses behind shock responsive social protection, even if they are looking to use some of their tools in a limited way. And this is because the current DRM approach, it does rely on international agencies to fill the gap between what's necessary and what the government can do. And the 2016 drought is definitely testing this model. And while this does imply a more strategic approach to dealing with slow onset emergencies, to dealing with drought, to dealing with the food insecurity impacts, it's just not obvious that social protection has a major role to play in this because it has limited coverage and limited capacity. So it might be able to add a little bit on top, but it's not going to be shifting any of the burden. And even then, these are overstretched systems. So adding a little bit is a bit questionable. Is this where priority should be? And ultimately, we think actually the priority should be on improving the operations and the reach of the programs on their own terms and enhancing preventative functions. Now, the system still could be more responsive, and I'm happy to discuss more of that in the questions. But for the PSSB, for example, sometimes payments are not made in January. This is a time where affected by either drought or flooding, or more commonly affected. And that's just owing to the budget approval process in the government. So you could do a double payment in December, which would be budget neutral and could help those households have capacity to manage shocks in the future. So just because it can't be necessarily a system responding to shocks, it could be more responsive in that respect. But we do believe that currently increasing the roles in response and recovery are beyond the administrative capacity and should not really be a priority. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for another very interesting presentation. So we've seen there two contrasting examples, one from Kenya, where the social protection system is being used in response to an emergency, and the other from Mozambique, where the disaster risk management function is operating quite well, and the social protection system perhaps has limited coverage to be able to be the focal point for responses to emergencies. Thank you very much for the questions that have been coming in as our two speakers have been presenting. We now have about 35 minutes where the floor will be open to questions, so I will field some of the questions to the variously to Sarah or Catherine as appropriate. We'll try to answer as many as we can of your questions during this session, but all of the answers will also be written down, as well as any that we don't manage to get round to. And all of the answers will be available in the next few days on the socialprotection.org platform afterwards. So do keep your questions coming in, and you will get a response either now or later. I'm going to start with a couple of questions for you, Catherine, if I may. There is some interest in the audience about the coordination and collaboration with the government in Kenya. So we have one question about how you worked with the government of Kenya to design the program. If you could explain a little bit about whose preferences were followed and why when the design was come up with. And a related question more generally about intersectoral coordination amongst the different government agencies during the implementation stage and some of those main challenges. Catherine, could we start with those?
Yes, sure. Thank you. I suppose to say that the National Drought Management Authority, is a government agency, and it's within the Ministry of Devolution and Planning. So, and HSNP is a program within NDMA. So, basically in developing that framework that I was showing, and the modelling of the costs, it was pretty much all done with the government. So there were regular workshops where people were asked to answer those questions, where to put how much, what's the trigger, when, how much, how often, geographically, etc. And like I said, initially people were all over the place, and there was quite a wide variety of, oh, we've got to be very generous, we've got to give to existing beneficiaries as well as new beneficiaries. But the cost model did help to focus the mind. So the government was very involved in it because it was basically a government-led program. Saying that, NDMA has worked pretty much on its own in this, because it is the drought management agency and it has been coordinating DRM, humanitarian response, all the early warning data. Kenya has a much wider social protection program, which is the National Social Protection Program, and that includes different ministries, including the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, and that has OVC programs and programs for the LD. The process of merging those cash transfers and that social protection program is ongoing at the same time as this. And so that has, that is a long and slow, painful process, really, of merging all of the different cash transfer programs within the government. But that is the routine cash transfer programs. Only HSNP has this scalability element, and it's only operational in those 4 counties at the moment. So it doesn't have so much to do with the other ministries. I don't know if that's answering the question sufficiently.
Thank you. Yes, that was very useful clarification. I now have a question that's possibly relevant to, there's a couple of questions that are relevant to both of you, so perhaps we could discuss first in relation to Mozambique and then to Kenya, which is about the possible links between social protection and the climate change adaptation strategies. So there's a suggestion that maybe that the links between social protection and climate adaptation might be stronger. For example, Sarah, you're suggesting that the links between the social protection and the disaster risk management agencies were less strong. Could you say if there is a greater potential for joint working between social protection and climate change? And Catherine, also in relation to that, we have a question from Simon Anderson, who says that there is a program supporting local climate adaptation in Wajir, which is one of the counties where HSNP is working, and wondered to what extent there's compatibility between HSNP and programs like that.
Okay. Sarah, do you want to start? Yeah.
Sure, it's actually Simon Anderson who'd be most well placed to answer this question for Mozambique, as he's actually conducting research that's on this very topic. So I really do hesitate from my side to comment on it, but I think, an issue to stress is the fact that these systems need to be ready to help people in times to come, that as more people are affected by shocks that are related to climate change, there need to be systems in place to be able to reach them, to be able to take them on board. So I think in a way, you know, the shock responsive question is just so far down the road. It's saying, how can we use these systems to do more and more and more? And you know, in Mozambique, there's really the idea of, well, how can we make sure that these systems are going to be able to help people in times to come, at a time when their coverage is extremely low, when they're not necessary, and you know, reaching a lot of people in these areas where you can imagine they're going to be affected by shocks related to climate change for some time to come. And I think that's why we need to be really careful about asking way too much of these systems and looking at them to go, you know, to step 10 when we need to make sure that they're able to, that they're in a sense already going to be resilient to some of the issues that are going to face them in the future. So for reaching people, for having the caseloads, and for having the programs in place. So I'll stop there but to say that actually Simon Anderson and current work also being done by OPM, I think, is quite relevant to that, and I apologize that I'm not better placed to speak to it.
Yeah, if I just come in on that. I think, yes, I think the linkages between social protection, climate change, adaptation in many ways are much stronger than between that and DRM. One of the issues, I suppose what we're coming back to here is this issue of creating resilient communities. And I do think that, I mean, in Kenya, the social protection, the routine beneficiaries are definitely the group that benefit most in that they have this routine and regular payment. And I think what we're seeing is that gives households such a head start in being able to adapt their livelihoods, because they know they have this income with which to rely on. It's coming whatever. It's not waiting for drought. And you know, a lot of the households, they tell us that they borrow against that, they can borrow money against the fact that they have this income, and they can make livelihood strategy choices and decisions on the basis that they know they've got this income for 4 years. That's how long this phase of the program lasts. Whereas the scaled up beneficiaries, of course, don't have any of that you know, guarantee of the money. We can't tell them even next month if they're going to have a payment or not. We're just waiting to see the VCI data, and then it goes out. So therefore that money is really just like, in a way, food relief. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't, meant we had a bit extra food. And as we're seeing, is the scale-up payments are just used for very much immediate needs. They cannot, the scale-up payments cannot be used for adaptation in any way. They're really just a consumption, they're to smooth consumption in a hard month. And that's why I think linking the longer-term social protection, climate change adaptation activities is something that very much, in fact, with DFID and the government, we want to look at next, is how can we link up these people who are getting regular cash transfers with other initiatives that can help them address possibly changing livelihood options as pastoralism becomes a bit less viable in a lot of these areas. So we would, yeah, be more than happy actually to contact Simon about what's happening in Wajir in thinking about the next phase of HSNP.
Great, thank you. That links quite nicely to another point that has been raised about the mechanism, the social protection mechanism that is being used in each of these cases. So in HSNP we have a purely cash transfer support. In Mozambique we saw that there were other types of social protection program that might have the potential to be used. And one listener is asking whether the two of you have a view as to whether cash or, for example, public works programs would have a better ability to respond to shocks, and if there would be any risks involved in relying mainly on public works. Sarah, maybe do you want to start with that, as Mozambique has the public works program?
I mean, as a humanitarian, I'm personally biased that if you weren't looking at, say, government preference and concerns that people need to work for money, it is just so much cheaper to give people money than to set up a works program around it, just because there's administrative steps that you need to take in order to ensure the works and to, you know, check it out, make sure people did it, and then facilitate the payment. So it's always easier to give people money, and it's usually cheaper to it. But at the same time, in Mozambique, the government definitely does not want to do that. So you're looking much more at the works. But I think to the extent that you do consider public works, and I think public works is a bit of a strong term for some of the things that are being done. It's small projects that aren't necessarily directed to creating meaningful assets. But I think it's quite important to consider the wage levels that are being done, because if you're looking at this to perform whether it's a preventative function or to tide people over at certain times, the wage levels in Mozambique are so low that it would be, I think, extremely overambitious to expect them to be achieving that. And there's also research being done by Anna McCord that was looking at the PASH and essentially said, if this is the vector by which we're hoping to assist people, whether that's to perform a preventative function, or I guess we could expand that to say, in other ways, then you would essentially need to be looking at the wage level. And again, if you look at the types of, when you give people, whether it's vouchers or cash transfers as a form of relief, and if you tie that to the objectives you're looking to achieve or the expenditure gaps that households place, I think it gives you more to play around with. But in Mozambique, it's a moot point because the government really does not want to provide cash transfers in an emergency, and they are looking at the PASH, the public works, to play a bit of a role. So it's working within variables that have tensions between them. And frankly, as a humanitarian, and this is very much a personal view, that's a reason why I would say, why on earth would we be looking to a social protection system that is just so inherently constrained in terms of sort of the amount of resources that it can transfer to people, the ability to deliver this, and that really needs to be doing better on its own terms to do what it is seeking to do when there is a well-functioning DRM system, which even if it can't, say, provide cash transfers, there are certainly other forms of relief that can be provided.
Great, thanks. And Catherine, what about your views on the use of the cash transfer rather than, say, public works or other types of social protection?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that Kenya is quite unique in a lot of the Horn of Africa anyway, and that the whole HSNP does not work on, it's unconditional, both for the routine beneficiaries and also for the scalability. If you're scaling up in response to drought, I mean, the biggest strength of the HSNP model is speed. The fact that you get VCI, which in itself is one of the earliest onset indicators, goes red, within 2 weeks people have money. And for me, it's people having money in their pocket as soon as possible in order to do something. That has got to be the most effective issue here. If you then insist, well, you can have the money, things are getting worse, but think you can have the money after we've planned, implemented and organised and checked your public works. Well, we're back to food aid, whereby everyone waited for the end of the rains, then did a long-range assessment, then started appealing for funding, for whether it be cash or food, and then started get the logistics of delivery. So, food arrived 6 months after the rains had stopped. And so I see public works as having the same delaying tactic in a humanitarian response that is unjustifiable, but governments are wedded to this belief that people shouldn't get something for nothing, even the very poorest and those that are most vulnerable. So personally, I think cash by itself and cash delivered on time to the right people will be used effectively by those people, and making very vulnerable populations work for that. I personally haven't seen really any major benefit in it, because they will work to improve their livelihood whatever.
Great, thank you. That's convincing arguments from both of you on the need for cash, which fits very naturally with the discussions earlier in the year on the high-level panel on cash transfers. There is a series of logistical questions here, of some practical questions from various people. Just continuing on the HSNP, Catherine, about the process for updating the wealth ranking and the household data. Questions that people are interested to know a little bit more, if you could explain a bit more about the frequency of the updating of the targeting, and also what procedures there are in place for any grievance procedures around the scale-up payments, which I guess maybe whether people are left on or off. other issues.
Yeah, this is an entire can of worms on which we could have 2 or 3 webinars by themselves. As ever, targeting was a really hot issue, and the methodology that was used, I did the evaluation for HSNP, and there were issues around it. You know, and it's not perfect, but you know, my view is no targeting system is perfect at all. So the idea was that there was going to be a review and a re-registration and a retargeting exercise within this phase of the 4-year program. However, because you know, the wider national social protection, national safety net program is looking at merging HSNP with an OVC cash transfer program, an older persons cash transfer program, and a people with severe disabilities cash transfer program. There has been this process of developing a harmonized joint re-registration and targeting policy and guidelines, and we're only at the beginning of piloting that revised methodology, and obviously working with completely different ministries and different cash transfer systems has slowed the whole process down. So there hasn't been the re-registration within the 4 years, but we certainly hope that we can start the re-registration in some of the HSNP areas in the next year. But yeah, so a new methodology which just to kind of combines a questionnaire to household, which you know is like that identifies proxies, so known as proxy means testing. I'm not completely sure how much people who are listening know about this, with a community validation of what the proxy means testing shows. And the idea is to identify groups of people for HSNP, older persons, OVC, severe disabilities, etc., all in one go, which makes a lot of sense, but is quite a it's quite an effort to get that process sorted. But a lot of progress has been made in developing draft national guidance on this. Was that the main part of the question? What was the other bit?
There was issues about the grievance procedures.
Oh, grievances. Yes, yeah, oh yeah. I mean, there is a whole rights and grievances element to HSNP, and there, I think, HelpAge were initially involved with the rights element. They had a whole contract in order to deal with rights-based issues, for example, exclusion or wrong inclusion of people. That was a big issue as part of when the initial lists of targeting lists came out, and really it has been agreed with everyone that yes, retargeting does need to be done. We need to learn from the first phase to do the second phase. But I think some of those things could be on the website for HSNP, some of the procedures and policies on that.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, a question for you in relation to targeting of the social protection programs in Mozambique. To what extent do you feel that the social protection programs are perhaps already, even if they're not very widespread, maybe they're already in the places that are most prone to repeated shocks? Because if the repeated shocks like the floods and the cyclones and the droughts are coinciding with poverty, then even a program that is narrowly targeted to a few geographical areas may actually be well targeted to areas that are prone to shocks. Do you have a sense of whether that is the case?
I mean, inevitably, when you have a social protection systems that are, throughout the country and are reaching poor people, eventually you're going to get poor people who are living in areas that are affected by shocks. So I think it's inevitable that there are going to be some people who are already a part of the program who are facing some of these issues. At the same time, and particularly if you look urban versus rural, so if you apply certain criteria, but I think that's, I don't want to say it's a moot point, but I think that it's a good thing if some of these programs are helping some of the people who are affected by these, but that's not really what they're designed to be dealing with. They're designed to be dealing with, dealing with the impacts of poverty, and designed to be dealing with different things. So it can't really substitute if those households are affected by certain shocks. So I think that while it's important that people who are affected by shocks can draw from a variety of different systems, whether they're government systems, informal systems, relief in place, it still doesn't substitute for the fact that they are going to be, if you're hit by something a bit harder, you're going to be needing more. And so if the government is doing a bit more with these existing programs, that could be potentially a bad idea if you really want to just focus on getting those programs right, if you want to focus on making sure you have the right level of benefit, if you want to focus on having the capacity to be able to do this well. So I think yes, I think they are probably getting some of those people, but that it's almost, I don't want to say besides the point, but it can't substitute for the fact that those people are going to be needing more if they are hit by a shock that is going to be affecting, say, their food security, that's going to be affecting their livelihoods. So it wouldn't be a substitute for assistance. And I find it very concerning as a humanitarian that there may be instances where people who are included in social protection programs might be considered as covered, both by ENASH or by INGC, so by the social protection folks and by the humanitarian folks. I think it shouldn't be a bad thing if people who are already vulnerable, who are affected by a covariate shock, who are facing a drought, or who are facing a flood, are still prioritized for additional assistance.
Sure, thank you. There's a few forward-looking questions here about what next in Kenya and Mozambique, so I'll suggest a couple of those. Catherine, a particular question on Kenya is whether there's been any discussion in Kenya about integrating this kind of responsive mechanism to some of the other programs within the national safety net programs, such as the ones that you referred to for orphans and vulnerable children or to older people. Or do you expect it to be something that's just going to remain limited to the HSNP?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, they're in the process of having a harmonized approach, so the full cash transfers actually sort of will work in harmony with each other. The only one that is identified to scale up is HSNP, and in many ways the idea is that for example, all older persons that are poor would be covered by a routine cash transfer anyway. At the moment, those other programs pay a little bit less per month than HSNP. So currently, we still scale up to those programs. So HSNP takes on the role of scaling up to that entire population, even if within that population, routine cash transfers have been provided to different groups. Only existing routine HSNP beneficiaries do not get a scale-up. Yeah, the scale-up goes beyond them. So I think, you know, as the merger process continues, we'll be clearer about how scale-up goes on beyond that. But the idea with the other categorical cash transfers, that you actually are just trying generally to that means so all severe disabled would be covered. Therefore, you wouldn't be severely disabled in a crisis. Of course, there is then the issue: should we give them more money in a crisis? But we definitely haven't got to that stage yet. The main thing is having a harmonised approach to targeting and scaling up to the wider population in the HSNP counties.
Sure, great, thank you. So, so if you're an older person receiving a cash transfer in an HSNP county, you may be eligible for the scale-up just as much as anybody else.
Yes, although at the moment you could be an older person and be on HSNP, or you could be an older person and be on older person cash transfers. You shouldn't ideally be on both, but we're not completely sure that's not happening at the moment because all these programs have up to now been targeted and rolled out separately. As part of the re-registration, they'd all be targeted and rolled out together, so older persons would be prioritised for the older person cash transfers. If there was a situation where they didn't have enough quota or enough resources, you may then put those older persons onto HSNP if they were then considered the most vulnerable in that community still, if you see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, a forward-looking question for Mozambique. Donors can play a big role in strengthening systems to respond to the needs of the affected communities. And a questioner is asking, what are the perspectives for donor actions in relation to all of this in Mozambique at the moment? What's the plan?
Oh, that's a big question. I think there's a lot of different donor perspectives, both when it comes just independently to social protection and what different donors want out of it. And in looking at whether or not there's an increased role for for social protection to to play when it comes to climate variability, when it comes to shocks, etc. And I think what was interesting about Mozambique is that there were 3 studies going on, one by Irish Aid led by Simon Anderson that was looking at climate resilience, one by OPM that was looking at the extent to which the PASH could play a role related to more climate change adaptation, and then this OPM one that I was involved in. And when you look at the results of, and I don't want to speak to any of the other studies' results, but I think that there's just a concern about how the effectiveness of social protection is actually going to be challenged by increased climate variability, and that we need to be very careful at looking at the system to do more. In fact, we shouldn't at all. It's that these social protection systems very much need to be strengthened on their own right. They need to start have the capacity and the funding and the resources to do what they're designed to do in terms of their own objectives. And they do need to eventually be more, more sensitive to the fact that, climate change and other things will be affecting caseloads in the future. So I think, being forward-looking in Mozambique, the prioritization should be on the strengthening of existing social protection systems and not on overloading with expectations on what these systems should be achieving. So not extending their role, to say.
Sure, thank you. Getting some more overarching questions. I've got a large question here for you, Catherine, on Kenya, which is, would you say that the Kenya HSNP, the shock responsive mechanism, has been effective? Do you think it's a model that can be borrowed by any similar country or environment?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what the key point of that question is, what do we mean by effective? Yeah, what was it meant to do, scaling up? And I suppose we have to think that scaling up, providing a very temporary expansion to a wider population because a wider population is being affected by a short-term shock, such as drought, is really replacing sort of the food aid response, really. It's providing some consumption support at a time of immediate need. And that's why we are seeing the majority of the money being spent on food. I would, from the post-distribution monitoring that we've done, and we haven't done a vast amount because we haven't had that many scale-ups, people seem to get the cash, they get it in time, and they spend it on food. And if you can really only compare what we're trying to do with, for example, if WFP does food distribution, they do post-distribution monitoring. They check, did you get the food? Did you eat the food? Did it improve your dietary diversity or food frequency, etc.? And then really, I think we have to consider, is scaling up those scale-up payments, are they trying to do anything more than that? The regular cash transfers, the effectiveness of that, and obviously OPM actually evaluating that element of the program, and that's still all being studied. That's a very different question, because long-term reliable cash transfers over a longer period of time enable people to use them very differently to just a sort of a windfall of cash arriving this month. So yeah, that's something that we need to consider, is in the long term, what is effective? What are we trying to measure in terms of effectiveness of ad hoc scale-ups in at drought periods? I'm not sure.
And would you say that? Yeah, I think so. Would you say that improving food security of beneficiaries is something that you can see as being achieved through the horizontal expansion of the program, so through bringing in extra people?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be in the very basic post-monitoring that we've had. Yeah, people have spent the money on food, so they've had more food, and that cash has enabled them to access that food. But we do need to think about what would we rather they were accessing, or what did we intend them to do with that money. And I don't think we can argue that we would have intended them to do anything more than that. Potentially access maybe water, they have to buy water but the idea is obviously they use the money as they wish, and that gives them the freedom. But connecting, and one of the important things I think that we have found is we haven't seen any problem with markets, because a lot of people said you can't give that much cash to that many people that quickly and not see price inflation and scarcity, and we genuinely haven't seen that so far that we've picked up. So that is also very important, I think, in that it shows that and because therefore cash is then improving markets because it's being provided at scale. So that's a sort of a sub benefit potentially. That's a side benefit. But in terms of the actual household, I don't think it's much more than food. But I mean, we need to study this in more detail.
Sure, and as you say, OPM is conducting an evaluation on the HSNP as a whole at the moment, and so in the months there should also be an independent viewpoint on how effectively it's working, and also including some analysis of the emergency scale-up mechanism.
No, great.
We're reaching the last couple of minutes of the webinar. So I think at this stage I'd like to thank the panelists very much for your insights and also to our audience for your active participation. It's great to see that you're really engaged on the topic. There's a few questions that we haven't managed to have time to answer, and as I say, we will respond to all of them in writing over the next few days and post them on the socialprotection.org website, where there's an online community that you can join that is called Social Protection in Humanitarian, Fragile and Risk-Prone Contexts. So if you join that online community, you can then access the recordings of the webinar and also all of the answers to the questions, and you can write your own questions or make some contributions to others in the community who are interested in the topic. I think there is a lot of background documentation and reports, certainly from HSNP already. There's plenty on the HSNP website, and we can, when we answer the questions, we can also direct you to those documents if you're interested in the practicalities of things like how the scale-up was designed. As Catherine said earlier, there's some information on the HSNP website about those details. And in relation to Mozambique, the work that we're doing there on shock-responsive social protection systems, that report should be coming out over the next few months. So before the end of the year, we'll have a detailed report on that. And I think we're hoping that one member of our Mozambique team will be attending the National Social Protection Week, which I think is due to go ahead in Mozambique in October. So you may hear from us around then with some more news from Mozambique. So in the meantime, thank you again for your active participation. We'll end the webinar now, and when you sign off, we kindly invite you to fill in the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar so that we can receive feedback, and hopefully we'll be able to improve the next webinars in this series. And do the webinar on social protection probably at 3 months' time. We'll be able to discuss some more practical examples from other countries. So thank you very much, and the webinar.